The biting chill of late autumn 1945 clung to the repurposed Wehrmacht barracks outside Frankfurt am Main, now designated as a provisional American military detention facility for high-value German female prisoners. The air, thick with the smell of stale disinfectant and damp concrete, offered a stark contrast to the structured, often ornate prisons many of these women had known. The facility, hastily converted, retained the grim functionality of its previous life, but the American modifications were immediately apparent and deeply unsettling. Gone were the solid, imposing cell doors of German penitentiaries, replaced by open, mesh-like bars that offered no privacy, no respite from the constant, intrusive gaze of their captors. This was the initial visceral shock for women like Helga Schmidt, a former SS auxiliary in her mid-30s, whose rigid posture and unyielding gaze belied a growing internal tremor. She had served as a secretary in a camp administration, her complicity rooted in bureaucratic efficiency rather than direct brutality, yet her loyalty to the Reich remained unshaken. Beside her, Ilse Richter, a 27-year-old former secretary to a high-ranking Nazi official, clutched her threadbare coat, her youthful features etched with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. She had been arrested in her apartment in Munich, accused of aiding and abetting war crimes through her administrative duties. Then there was Greta Müller, a 58-year-old former political prisoner under the Nazi regime, ironically now incarcerated by the Allies for her tangential association with a resistance group that had once sought to negotiate with the Western powers. Her cynicism, honed by years of Gestapo interrogations, offered a thin shield against the new reality. These women, drawn from diverse backgrounds across a defeated Germany, from the bombed-out streets of Berlin to the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, represented a cross-section of female involvement in the Third Reich, both voluntary and coerced. Their ages spanned from early 20s to late 60s, their origins varied, but their shared experience was a profound misunderstanding of their current predicament. The American Guards, often young GIs from rural America, spoke a rapid, unfamiliar English, their demeanor a perplexing blend of informality and detached authority. They chewed gum, joked amongst themselves, and addressed the prisoners with a casualness that Helga, accustomed to the strict military hierarchy of the Wehrmacht and SS, found deeply disrespectful. The German prison system, even for women, emphasized order, discipline, and a clear, if harsh, structure. Cells had solid doors, offering a modicum of personal space, a psychological barrier against the outside world. Here, the cage-style cells, with bars on all four sides and a mesh ceiling, meant constant visibility. Every movement, every private moment was exposed. There was no hiding, no retreat. This constant exposure was a deliberate design choice, a pragmatic American approach focused on security and control through transparency. A stark contrast to the German philosophical emphasis on authoritarian control through physical barriers and rigid, often brutal discipline. Helga, with her ingrained sense of order, immediately attempted to impose a semblance of German discipline within her cell, meticulously folding her meager blanket, arranging her few possessions with military precision. Ilse, overwhelmed, found herself unable to sleep. The constant light and the sound of other prisoners, guards, and the distant rumble of American trucks, a relentless assault on her senses. Greta, ever the observer, watched the guards, trying to decipher their intentions, their language, their strange customs. They all tried to maintain a facade of dignity, to cling to the remnants of their former selves, but the environment chipped away at it relentlessly. The American Guards, oblivious to the nuances of German social hierarchy, treated all prisoners with the same detached efficiency, further eroding the women's sense of individual status. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The loss of privacy felt like a constant violation, the open bars a symbol of their utter vulnerability. Their understanding of imprisonment, built on a foundation of solid walls and rigid, predictable rules, was being systematically dismantled. They were not just behind bars, they were on display, their entire concept of incarceration challenged to its core. This was not the punishment they expected. It was something far more unsettling, a silent, psychological assault that left them feeling exposed and profoundly disoriented. The realization dawned slowly, chillingly, that their entire understanding of imprisonment was being challenged, not by overt brutality, but by an insidious, pervasive lack of privacy and an alien system of control. The brutal reality of daily life in American military custody quickly solidified, a relentless grind that chipped away at the prisoners' resolve. The cage-like cells, approximately 8 by 10 feet, offered no sanctuary. Bars on all sides meant that even the most intimate acts were performed under the watchful, if often indifferent, eyes of guards and fellow inmates. The lack of privacy was a constant, gnawing humiliation. Communal facilities, such as the open-stall latrines and showers, further stripped away any pretense of personal space, a stark contrast to the more segregated facilities common in German prisons. The American food rations, primarily K-rations, and whatever local provisions could be secured, were a source of constant distress. Unfamiliar processed meats, canned vegetables, and a distinct lack of traditional German bread or potatoes made meals unpalatable for many. Helga Schmidt, whose stomach churned at the sight of the bland, often cold American fare, frequently pushed her plate away, her defiance a silent protest against the cultural assault. Ilse Richter, already frail, found herself losing weight, the unfamiliar diet exacerbating her anxiety. The strict schedules, announced in clipped English by the guards, bore little resemblance to the precise, almost ritualistic military routines the women had known. Wake-up calls were abrupt, mealtimes irregular by German standards, and the daily routine of exercise and chores felt haphazard and inefficient to their disciplined minds. Environmental challenges compounded their misery. The repurposed barracks, designed for temporary military housing, offered poor insulation against the harsh German winter. Drafts seeped through ill-fitting windows, and the heating, when available, was often insufficient, leaving the women shivering under thin blankets. The summer months brought stifling heat, the metal bars radiating warmth, turning the cells into oppressive ovens. Culturally, the clash was profound. The American Guards' informality, their use of first names or casual nicknames, their occasional jokes or whistling, was perceived by many German prisoners as a profound lack of respect, an affront to their ingrained sense of hierarchy and decorum. The language barrier was a constant source of frustration and misunderstanding, leading to misinterpretations and heightened tensions. Different concepts of discipline further exacerbated the divide, where German authority was often expressed through stern commands and rigid adherence to protocol. American discipline often manifested as a more pragmatic, direct, and sometimes seemingly arbitrary enforcement of rules. The psychological toll was immense. Stripped of their uniforms, their social status, and even their names, often referred to by numbers or simply prisoner, many experienced a profound loss of identity. The constant visibility, the feeling of being perpetually observed, led to a pervasive sense of humiliation and paranoia. The fear of the unknown, of what their American captors might do, was a constant undercurrent. Protagonists adapted in various ways. Helga, ever the rigid disciplinarian, attempted to impose order on her fellow prisoners, organizing their meager possessions, insisting on formal address, and attempting to maintain a semblance of German military precision in their daily routines. This often led to friction with other prisoners, who found her rigidity exhausting. Ilse, on the other hand, began to break down under the pressure. Her once neat appearance became disheveled, her eyes often red from crying, her appetite almost non-existent. She struggled with the language, often retreating into silence. Greta, with her years of experience navigating oppressive systems, adopted a more pragmatic approach. She began to observe the guards closely, attempting to pick up phrases of English, and formed quiet alliances with other older, more resilient prisoners, sharing observations and small acts of defiance, like hoarding a piece of bread. The contrast between German expectations of a hierarchical prison structure, where status might still afford some small privileges, and the American egalitarian approach to prisoner treatment was particularly jarring. To the Americans, all prisoners were equal in their incarceration, a concept that baffled and infuriated many of the former German officials. Specific incidents became flashpoints. A confrontation erupted when a young American guard, chewing gum loudly, addressed Helga as "Hey Fräulein" rather than Frau Schmidt. Helga, incensed, demanded proper respect, only to be met with a blank stare and a curt order to comply. Struggles with unfamiliar food led to several prisoners refusing meals, only to find the Americans simply removed the trays, offering no alternative. Attempts to maintain cleanliness, such as scrubbing the concrete floors with a piece of cloth, were often met with indifference or even mild amusement by guards who saw it as an unnecessary effort in a system designed for basic functionality, not German fastidiousness. The human cost was evident in the deteriorating mental health of many, marked by anxiety, depression, and chronic sleep deprivation. Physical ailments, from digestive issues to stress-induced headaches, became common. Relationships between prisoners, already strained by their shared predicament, fractured further as different coping strategies clashed. Despite these seemingly insurmountable obstacles, a grudging, often desperate process of adaptation began. They were learning to survive in this alien system, though success was far from guaranteed, and the psychological scars were already forming deep within. The turning point arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a slow, dawning realization among the German prisoners that the American system operated on an entirely different philosophical plane. Their rigid expectations of punishment, rooted in German authoritarianism, clashed violently with the pragmatic, almost clinical approach of their American captors. The Germans anticipated harsh physical retribution for infractions, a system of fear and pain. Instead, they received administrative sanctions, loss of meager privileges, isolation, or extended periods of standing. This was bewildering. Helga Schmidt, after a particularly defiant outburst where she refused to follow an order, braced herself for a beating, perhaps even solitary confinement in a dark, damp cell. Instead, she was placed in a quiet room, a bare, brightly lit cell with no bed for 72 hours, and her weekly ration of cigarettes was revoked. The absence of physical violence was more disorienting than its presence might have been. It removed the familiar enemy, the tangible threat, leaving her with an unsettling sense of psychological vulnerability. The informal attitudes of the American guards continued to perplex. They didn't bark orders with military precision. They often spoke in conversational tones, sometimes even attempting rudimentary German, which the prisoners found patronizing. There was no clear hierarchy among the guards that the prisoners could exploit or understand, just a uniform, detached efficiency. The German expectation of a hierarchical prisoner structure, where a senior inmate might emerge to mediate or control, was actively discouraged by the Americans, who treated every prisoner equally, undermining any attempts at internal organization. American observers, meanwhile, were meticulously documenting these reactions. Major Thompson, the prison commandant, a career military police officer, noted in his reports the peculiar German obsession with order and hierarchy, even in confinement. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a civilian psychologist attached to the military intelligence unit, meticulously recorded the cultural clash, observing that the German prisoners, accustomed to overt displays of power, are profoundly disoriented by the subtle, pervasive control exerted through constant visibility and psychological pressure rather than physical force. The American system demonstrated its effectiveness not through brutality, but through its relentless, almost invisible pressure. A German prisoner, expecting a violent response for defiance, instead received isolation and the loss of privileges, proving more psychologically effective than physical punishment. The doctrinal conflict was stark. German authoritarian prison philosophy presumed fear and physical control as primary tools for maintaining order and punishing transgression. The American approach, however, utilized psychological pressure, constant visibility, and the removal of dignity through a pervasive lack of privacy. It was a system designed to break the spirit, not just the body. The German prisoners' perplexity grew. Some, like Ilse Richter, broke faster under the psychological pressure of constant surveillance and the erosion of personal space than they might have under physical abuse. Others, like Greta Müller, found an unexpected resilience, adapting to the subtle cues of the American system, learning to navigate its strange logic. Yet others remained utterly bewildered, unable to reconcile the lack of overt violence with the profound sense of oppression they felt. Specific incidents highlighted this clash. A hunger strike organized by a small group of defiant prisoners failed spectacularly. The Americans simply waited them out, offering no concessions, merely ensuring medical observation. After 3 days, the hunger strikers, weakened and demoralized by the lack of any dramatic response, capitulated. An attempt to organize a prisoner hierarchy, with Helga Schmidt at its head, was immediately disrupted by guards who simply reassigned cells, breaking up the nascent power structure without a word of explanation or punishment, effectively neutralizing the effort. A confrontation where a prisoner expected violence never came, but the psychological impact of being ignored, of having her defiance met with a cold, administrative response, was devastating. Themes of cultural difference in punishment emerged. The American optimism that rehabilitation, or at least behavioral modification, was possible, contrasted sharply with the German fatalism about the inherent criminal nature of those incarcerated. The power of psychological control versus physical control became a central, if unspoken, lesson. The German prisoners were realizing they faced a challenge unprecedented in their experience. A system that didn't operate on principles they understood, making resistance itself problematic because they didn't know what they were truly resisting against. The bars were not just physical, they were a psychological barrier to their very comprehension of justice. As sentences concluded, or prisoners were transferred to other facilities, the lasting impact of their American incarceration became profoundly evident. For many, the experience in the cage-style prisons had been a crucible, forging a psychological transformation that transcended the immediate period of their confinement. Their rigid understanding of punishment and justice, honed by decades of German authoritarianism, had been shattered and reshaped by the relentless, pervasive psychological pressure of constant visibility and the absence of privacy. Their worldview, once unyielding, had been forced to confront a radically different system of control. The climate of release was a complex tapestry of emotions: relief at freedom, mixed with a profound disorientation at returning to a defeated, unrecognizable Germany. There was gratitude for survival, yet also a deep-seated shame for what they represented, and an overwhelming uncertainty about their future. The consequences of their imprisonment transcended the immediate experience. Many returned to a Germany grappling with its own identity, finding that their time in American custody had made them aliens in their own culture. They had witnessed firsthand how societies could control behavior through mechanisms far more subtle and insidious than brute force. The American approach, which had initially seemed chaotic and disrespectful to German sensibilities, had proven remarkably effective. The constant visibility and psychological pressure, they realized, could be far more devastating and transformative than physical punishment. The fate of the protagonists offered profound reflections. Helga Schmidt, released in 1948, returned to a bombed-out Berlin. The rigid beliefs that had once defined her were now useless, her sense of order an anachronism in the chaos. She carried the psychological scars of both her complicity and her punishment, struggling to reintegrate into a society that viewed her with suspicion. Ilse Richter, after a shorter sentence, managed to emigrate to Argentina, one of many Germans seeking to escape their past. Yet the memory of the cage-like cells, the constant gaze, haunted her dreams, a psychological imprint that no distance could erase. Greta Müller, the cynical observer, returned to Germany and, surprisingly, became an advocate for prison reform. Her experience under both Nazi and American systems gave her a unique perspective, and she used her voice to highlight the psychological impact of incarceration, arguing for more humane, yet still effective, methods of control. Some of these women became case studies in military psychology, their reactions and adaptations meticulously documented by researchers like Dr. Eleanor Vance, whose classified reports on the cultural clash in prison systems would later inform post-war penal reforms. Others simply disappeared into anonymity, their stories overshadowed by the more prominent male war criminals. Decades later, historians studying the occupation period would unearth these records, interviewing elderly survivors, piecing together a forgotten aspect of female Nazi prisoners and collaborators whose narratives were often marginalized. This historical legacy underscored the profound cultural clash in prison systems, validating the efficacy of psychological approaches to punishment. It was a testament to American pragmatism confronting German authoritarianism, even within the confines of a prison. The formal conclusion of their imprisonment, the final confrontations with American authorities, and the last views of the cage-like cells that had become their world, marked not an end, but a beginning of a new, often difficult existence. The rediscovery of these stories, through declassified documents and survivor testimonies, reintegrated them into the broader historical narrative as a powerful example of cultural transformation at the most personal level. Imprisonment under a foreign system had forced a confrontation with radically different values, challenging fundamental assumptions about human nature and justice. The experience proved something profound about the human capacity to adapt to alien systems and emerge transformed, albeit scarred. It showed how ordinary women who committed extraordinary crimes faced an extraordinary punishment that challenged their entire worldview. And it demonstrated how a nation, in the aftermath of total war, demonstrated its approach to justice even toward its enemies, innovating in prison psychology born from wartime necessity, forever changing the understanding of punishment itself. Dive deeper into the untold stories of Wutu and the psychological battles fought behind enemy lines. Subscribe to our channel for more gripping historical narratives and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of this cultural clash in justice systems resonate most with you? Your engagement fuels our exploration of history's most compelling moments.